I understand in triage, I understand why from a utilitarian health perspective, you want to sort of abandon the people who are old and weak and focus your attention on the people who have higher chance of survival. I don't understand why that logic works from a Christian perspective.
You taking that one, Andy, or you want me to?
You can go first, Lydia.
I mean, so it's interesting because when you start labeling, you know, people, so I'm a medical ethicist, right? So when people start using the language strict utilitarian and it's used in this very sort of harsh, almost judgmental way, at the same time, when the choice is we keep people alive or we use scarce resources for people who won't benefit, you tell me what doctors are supposed to do. You know, I mean, we want people to live. We want to help as many people as possible. That's the way we're wired. And I mean, especially people who work in healthcare. And so to try to relieve the suffering, and our goal is to relieve everyone's suffering, right? So even if it is not possible to save a person's life who's suffering from advanced respiratory distress, we still have ways to help people be comfortable. So we're not aspiring to care for some and not care for others. That's not the goal. We care for everyone. It's just that at some point, maybe we're not at all there. It may be that technology, we have to figure out who gets the technology and who doesn't. But I think the minute that we call it, you know, this sort of hard utilitarian logic, it sounds like it's a game changer, and I don't think that's what we're after.
This is
where the language matters, right?
Yeah. Let's jump over to Andy. Andy, you've had a little time to think about David's question.
I would want to distinguish between the inevitable allocation of resources that's necessary in any situation of a stressed system, right? Wartime triage, or this may get to the point of wartime, and I would never want to, I can't imagine being in that position, but I would never want to armchair quarterback that. I think there's another kind of utilitarianism that we're at risk of, which is deciding that we just can't bear suffering of a more generalized sort as a society enough to give the public health system the room it needs to adapt. And that's a very different thing from a doctor making a tough decision in a hallway about who gets to be wheeled into the specialized room and who doesn't. That's our whole society kind of either throwing up our hands and giving up, or saying, no, actually, we are going to just bear a great deal more than we thought we could. For the sake of, in the long run, saving lives and not committing a kind of act of moral outrage. I've been thinking about this idea that's come out of the study of soldiers in war, which you guys are all very familiar with, the idea of moral injury, which is the idea of just having been present for the committing of acts that were violent and violating is really difficult for human beings to bear. And there's two categories. One is where you committed some atrocity in some direct way, and that does sometimes happen, and you have some sense of agency and responsibility. But there's also this other kind of thing, which I wouldn't call guilt, but more horror, like moral horror, that I had to watch while this happened, even though I had no direct responsibility for it. And I think we're going to need, as a culture, ways to handle potentially both kinds of moral injury. And in a sense, the question will be, how will we come to some sense of purification from what had to happen around us, even the best case, what had to happen, and then certainly the worst case, if we end up, in retrospect, realizing we let a lot of people die who maybe didn't have to, in order for us to have a sense of safety or control or whatever.
So can I push back on this, Andy?
Yeah, of course.
So I have a concern, and the Wall Street Journal published on this yesterday, and it's been kind of coming up quite a bit, but I have a concern that and you touched on economy first, so I'm going to sort of circle back because this is related. but that what we're doing by shutting everything down with the hopes of mitigating spread, which for sure it mitigates some spread, and actually trying to flatten the curve. So for sure we want to try to keep people out of the healthcare systems because we don't want to overtax them, and they're quickly approaching that point. But the long-term consequences of completely shutting down the global economy, what this is going to do to suicide, to opioid addiction, to alcohol addiction,
Right.
to
Completely
kids
right.
who won't be able to go back to college because their parents lost their jobs and they can't afford the tuition. I mean, the downstream, and these are all health, right? Because at the end of the day, we know that socioeconomic status, education level, those all correlate with health. And there's tons of literature to show this. So if we're thinking that all of these, what we're doing with the economy and these efforts to save lives now, which as a physician I completely agree with, and I agree with the public health measures, it's intention with these long-term adverse health outcomes that we're going to see. And I'd be curious, just in your comments now, about you started to say sort of having to wrestle with this from a public health perspective. Is it that we actually need to accept human finitude and say we can't save everybody? Because we're going to be destroying the next generation. My 10-year-old daughter was sitting with an economist friend of ours, and she said, well, what do you mean they want to spend $2 trillion to bail things out? Who's going to pay for that? And our economist friend said, you are. It's going to be on the next generation to figure out how to. So all of it is about human life, right? We care desperately about, we don't want people to die. We want people to live, but we want people to live and flourish. And right now, sort of the current situation is not leading to human flourishing either. It's helping to mitigate the overwhelmed hospitals, but it's not leading to human flourishing. So I don't know. I'm sending it back to you guys.
I'm with you. I've been saying to some friends, there's more ways to die than COVID-19, and one is total isolation. That is a death sentence for a lot of people. So it's that's why I sort of think of it as moral horror, like that we're going to live through, no matter what course we take, we're going to live through something that's really tough to bear. I think there are more and less moral ways to live through it.
And if we don't get the economic bounce back that the 1918 flu pandemic saw in 1920, I don't think there's, I think it's going to get really bad. But I'm not trying to be prophetic here. I don't know. David, do you want to weigh in on this?
I was about to say the same thing. I mean, how do you begin to, it's trade-offs. I mean, you're balancing really tough trade-offs. How do you begin to think your way through that? So yeah, David.
Well, it's a decision to make every day. And right now the decision is clear. The shutdown that we're doing, it seems to me, for the next 2 months or at least 6 weeks is the right thing to do. I mean, there could be a rise in suicide. I worry about isolation has really bad effects on the immune system. Mm-hmm. And so I worry about that. Like the efforts we take to reduce the number of people who get the disease makes the people who get it possibly more likely to really suffer from it. And so all those downstream effects of solitude are real. But right now, they're not anything like the effects of a runaway pandemic. And so right now, I think our course is very clear. And I think the president is making a mistake in talking about April 15th and things like that. But then as we get further down the road, I mean, maybe I misunderstand this, but a friend of mine, Yuval Levin, wrote that we need a hard stop and then a slow opening. And so we had to hard stop the economy right now to halt the spread. But then gradually we begin to open things up as we get hopefully a little better grip. I remain, maybe it's just my nature, I remain more optimistic than most people that it'll be shorter than we think. I have no medical basis. It's just my nature to think that way. And so, but I would like to see, parts of the economy open up. I think a lot about what it will be like when a lot of people have had the disease and are at least temporarily immune, and they're out partying, and the rest of us are self-isolating or self-distancing. How that becomes much harder to self-distance when half your friends are out partying.